Hi, my name is Leah Higgins, and I'm the SILIP's Digital Assistant, and I'm joined here by my colleagues.
Hi everyone, I'm Kirsten McQuarrie, Sector Development Manager for SILIPS, and especially relevant today, I'm also the moderator of the Green Libraries Network.
And I'm Sean McNamara, Director of SILIP Scotland.
Together, and with some special guests too, we're going to share the story of green libraries, as we would define it from a Scottish library perspective. Libraries today are playing an essential role in tackling the climate crisis, and this episode is intended to showcase this work and explore the transformative presence of libraries in this discussion.
Maintaining the momentum of COP26, the UN Climate Change Conference, which took place in Glasgow in November 2021, it has never been more vital for our profession here in Scotland to play its part in encouraging change, combating misinformation about the stark reality of the climate crisis, and embedding sustainable practices into our ways of working.
The first chapter of this story doesn't start at the beginning of the Green Libraries story, although that may seem counterintuitive. It starts with an encounter which has shaped the way that we think about libraries, knowledge, information, and what these themes can borrow from the natural world. In early 2023, we welcomed Ian Littleworth, Future Libraries Manager from Kapiti Coast Libraries in New Zealand. He shared with us the concept and workings of the Te Tōtara capability framework. The framework takes the shape and life cycle of a tree. From planting the seeds of the project, the tōtara in the forest to symbolise concept overview, the roots, the trunk, the branches, and the fallen leaves which return to the floor to create the nutrients for the roots to support the growth of the forest. In the accompanying welcome to the pack, they preface that this sector is incredibly diverse, built on its different cultural and linguistic backgrounds, adding many areas of professional specialisation and serving a variety of communities across the Motu. In spite of the majority of libraries still operating as silos, there are numerous commonalities that join us together. The ethos of librarianship, guardianship over our collections, the passion to help feed the minds of our diverse communities, and the drive to keep people connected with their heritage. If we think about this podcast in very much the same way, borrowing this framework which so beautifully illustrates from its very roots the link between libraries and the natural world, which it plays a part in protecting, to share the story of green libraries. The seeds are the ideas and professional development which librarians sow and reap benefit from. The roots are the history of this connection. Libraries are bound in the earth, taking nutrients from the knowledge they seek to strengthen and arm the profession with, and turning it into fresh air for the benefit of their communities. The trunk is the steadfast, immovable force of libraries, and the branches which grow from this are how they seep into communities and create tangible and meaningful connections. With this framework in mind, and with thanks to Ian Littleworth for sharing this gem of knowledge with Scottish library professionals, we want to truly begin this story with the roots, the history of this connection, and how sustainability and nature help the profession to stand tall and strong.
Before we get into the crux of this episode, one thing we must do as a matter of keeping this story accessible and enjoyable is explain some of the language and eco-jargon that we'll be using throughout. Whilst we won't get into the nitty-gritty of the technicalities or the technology, it's important that we define what we mean when we talk about carbon, or sustainability for example. As an accompaniment to this episode, we also have a jargon sheet, which you can check whilst you're listening in case you need to remind yourself what something means.
So firstly, the United Nations defines climate change as long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns. They go on to explain that such shifts can be natural due to changes in the sun's activity or large volcanic eruptions, but since the 1800s, human activities have been the main driver of climate change, primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil and gas. Burning fossil fuel generates greenhouse gas emissions that act like a blanket wrapped around the earth, trapping the sun's heat and raising temperatures.
One of the best resources for increasing the accessibility of sustainable language comes from our Green Libraries Partnership colleagues, Julie's Bicycle, who have created a whole webpage dedicated to deciphering green gibberish. So their definition of climate justice reads as follows. Climate justice is about where human rights, social justice, and the climate and environmental movement intersect. It is the need to recognise climate change as a systemic issue, which is not purely environmental or scientific, but also ethical and political. An issue which includes conversations about equity, colonialism, and the disparity between distribution of resources and wealth. climate justice connects up intergenerational issues and stewardship for future generations. And it's about renewing the social contract to protect those most vulnerable, both locally and globally. To do this, we need to acknowledge the histories and legacies of violence against BIPOC, Black, Indigenous and people of colour, and recognise and redress the fundamental inequalities, prejudice and oppression that exist today, meaning marginalised communities around the world are the worst and first affected by climate change and environmental disaster.
If we then talk about a digital carbon footprint, Julie's Bicycle defines it as the environmental impact of sending our colleagues a simple email, sharing a meme with a group chat, or video calling our mums. Also adding that if the internet was a country, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, it would be the 6th largest polluter. Interestingly, 34% of carbon emissions come from devices, i.e. energy used to power our phones or desktops. 29% is emitted from the construction, operation and maintenance of communication networks. A further 21% comes from the construction, manufacture and operation of the centres that store all of the data on the internet.
We'll also touch later on carbon literacy. The Carbon Literacy Trust defines carbon literacy as an awareness of the carbon costs and impacts of everyday activities and the ability and motivation to reduce emissions on an individual, community and organisational basis.
Net zero, a term we'll hear several times during this episode, is defined by the United Nations as cutting carbon emissions to a small amount of residual emissions that can be absorbed and durably stored by nature and other carbon dioxide removal measures, leaving zero in the atmosphere.
And finally, sustainability can be defined in slightly different ways depending on who you ask, but the heart remains the same. The definition of sustainable development given from the UN World Commission on Environmental and Development states that sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Just a reminder that you can check up on any of these phrases throughout the episodes on our website. And now that we've hopefully laid the appropriate foundation of context and language we'll be using throughout, we're going to go on to telling the story of green libraries.
One of the earliest examples of libraries and nature being intertwined comes from a letter by Cicero in 46 BC. If you have a garden and a library, you have everything you need. This is such a potent, powerful idea that we've drawn on multiple times for Phillips Go Green and Green Library Scotland because it captures the idea of libraries as an evergreen resource with knowledge and information at their hearts, which can provide you with everything and anything you need to sustain yourself. Just in the same way that a garden can provide sustenance, shelter, clothing, nourishing body and mind alike in a wonderfully grounding way.
Another way that we think about libraries under this topic is the idea that libraries are the inaugural recyclers, the first institution within a community which has recycling, reusing and repurposing at its heart. Using your local library is helping contribute to sustainability because you're reusing resources without the need to purchase single-use items or items that will eventually end up in landfill. Libraries can harness radical and innovative potential as an alternative to individual consumerism. Not only this, but by supporting your local library, you're also allowing libraries to tackle the climate crisis on behalf of the communities they support, through engagement, funded projects and more. But what does this look like in practice? Can libraries really have that big an impact on a community or in the climate crisis? Well, later in this episode, we'll explore just how big a difference Scotland's librarians and information professionals are making across the country.
So what else do libraries have to offer this conversation? Yep, there's always more with libraries. In fact, fitting into one episode is quite tough, as you'll discover as you listen on. Well, they provide access to quality information, and librarians are there to help promote critical thinking and analysis of the information you find. In order to grow the best and most robust collection of information about the climate crisis and make informed and conscious decisions about how your movements impact the planet. Looking at green libraries, it's clear that discussions have been going on about the library's place since the early 1990s at least. A paper written by Monica Antonelli in 2008 titled The Green Library Movement, An Overview and Beyond captures a lot of what was going on in American libraries from the 1990s onwards. It seems that until recently, the same efforts of libraries in the UK, or more specifically in Scotland, may have not been getting captured in quite the same way.
We're lucky that within the SILIP's context, we have the very person who connected the dots and has pioneered the support for sustainability initiatives in the Scottish library sector, not only with us in the studio, but on the SILIP's team. Kirsten, as the person to create the SILIP's Go Green programme, can you share with us how it came about around the time that COP26 arrived in Glasgow?
Absolutely, Leah. And like pretty much everything in library-led sustainability, this was very much a team effort. This was actually 2021 marked my first year SILIP staff, and Sean and I had been working to develop a range of resource collections in everything from accessibility to active anti-racism to feminism for libraries, and it made sense that sustainability would be a key part of that. Bringing these resources together was a key part of defining and developing our ethical practice, so much so that we've recently added climate justice to the SILIP's EDI commitment. So the SILIP's Go Green collection began as a recommended reading collection. We then quickly felt that there was more than enough scope to bring together some Green Libraries champions in an online event, and this led to our first interview series, perhaps in some ways a precursor to the SILIP's podcast. What I loved about these online interviews was that they gave our participants space for connection as well as reflection, going in depth to their experiences and giving insights in a way that this subject really requires, and which time and time again libraries are the ones to provide that space in every sense.
So what has the reception been like to SILIP's Go Green and beyond, as that resource collection has continued to grow, starting as a single web page but is now part of an entire community?
I think that point about community is exactly it when it comes to this subject. The growth of SILIP's Go Green into Green Library Scotland has been wholly down to our membership taking this work to the very heart of how they understand the role that library professionals like them can and should play in their communities. For example, every year of the Green Library Scotland grant fund to date, we've pretty much doubled the number of applications we've received, and we see at our annual conference too that these collective efforts mean a great deal to delegates. I feel like SILIP's 24 could be used as an example for other conferences on how to run a sustainable event, said one for example, while another told us that they really appreciated the amount of thought that went into our creative efforts to reduce our carbon footprint, keeping this issue front and centre. Someone else told us that they've already planted their wildflower seeds, a complementary asset within the now iconic SILIP swag bags, and they're looking forward to seeing them bloom.
What has been your favourite piece of learning from the project, something that might be of interest to our listeners?
So again, actually returning to our annual conference, the motivation behind this year's inaugural coffee cup competition, which meant that everybody who brought their reusable cup to Dundee was entered into a prize draw to win a coffee gift card. It was learning that if everyone in Scotland switched from single-use to reusable coffee cups, we could save an incredible 4,100 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent every year. Data like that demonstrates how small, simple actions at an individual level really can make a meaningful difference if you're part of a growing community like the SILIP sphere. And most importantly of all, how library staff are uniquely placed to share information like this to grow climate literacy within their communities in turn.
While SILIPS was busy in this time creating the resource bank and growing awareness of climate issues through events, blogs and other content, a cultural shift in the Scottish library sector was taking place. A consciousness of these issues was being awakened, catalysed and highlighted by this international forum. It felt necessary in this discussion of the sector to invite some voices of institutions and people who are really changing the game, becoming the places which people look to for guidance and inspiration on this topic.
Glasgow Women's Library is an established institution that just celebrated its 33rd birthday, and as you'll hear later, it's a greenhouse of inspiration, collecting women's voices and stories, and they've been doing a lot of work to their physical space and within their community to raise their profile and address climate change. Another incredible library space, which has found a new lease of life as a now permanent residence, is the Nature Library in Irvine. This authentic former shipworkers' flat, just feet away from the harbour side, collects specifically all different kinds of books about nature. Although the Nature Library has been in this permanent space for less than a year, its reputation is already building up an incredible following from its once travelling status. Both organisations are firmly taking root within their communities, so we wanted to explore how the Nature Library and Glasgow Women's Library are thinking about the climate, to really explore the conversations and innovations that are taking place within our sector.
In this segment of the podcast, we'd like you to follow us in a vision. Imagine any library of your choosing from a bird's eye angle, the facade of the library made with the fabric of your imagination. Now imagine the walls become glass. As you start to become closer to the walls, you see inside a collection of people, a community. It's got a certain warmth that you'd only feel in your local library. As you continue to zoom into this image, you see the fabric of what makes a library, the intangible sense of community spirit, but also the tangible books, resources, artwork, and more that line the walls. What are the shelves made from? What books specifically line the shelves? What are the books lined in? And how are they displayed or catalogued? Every single one of these features concerns the environment, and sustainable choices can be made to lessen the impact on the planet. Equally, these things can be harnessed to improve these circumstances of climate change that we find ourselves in. With this thought of inspecting the library, going from the outside in, we'd like to present you with this segment, in conversation with Glasgow Women's Library and the Nature Library. Take a listen now. We had an initial meeting about facilitating this conversation, and yes, it was a conversation about a conversation, which is pretty much status quo for podcasting. But one thing that we all felt we couldn't not talk about is the fact that this conversation is happening between 4 women. And beyond that, we shared our awareness of our own imposter syndrome in this field. And although we all at times sense it, this is the very topic where everyone is entitled to learn and everyone is qualified to participate and make a difference. One of the aims of this podcast is to demystify this language and hierarchy and to centre libraries as a place for discussions like this, where everyone is welcome. So I'd like to welcome our wonderful guests. If we could maybe just go around the podcast studio and introduce ourselves. I am Leah Higgins and I am the digital assistant here at SILP Scotland. Frequent listeners will be very familiar with this voice, and I'll pass over to my colleague Kirsten.
Yes, you'll know this voice as well, everybody. My name is Kirsten McQuarrie. I'm Sector Development Manager for SILP Scotland and, particularly important for this episode, moderator of the Green Libraries Network.
I am Christina Riley. I started a project called the Nature Library, which is a travelling library of nature writing, and opened a permanent space in Ayrshire this spring.
And I'm Annika Norrvik. I'm the Facilities Management Officer at Glasgow Women's Library, which is located in the east end of Glasgow. And I'm a member of our Green Cluster and also work on our Net Zero project.
I love that. How did they come up with the name of the Green Cluster? Because that's just such a visual, good image, I feel.
Yeah, no, at the Women's Library, we have these creative clusters which basically draw lots of different people from our team from different roles and volunteers and board members as well to work on kind of different areas of work in the library, such as the Green Cluster. We've got active welcome, fundraising, etc. So the Green Cluster works on kind of the net zero and green initiatives at the library, and we have members from kind of different parts of the organisation.
Back to what I was saying earlier on about us kind of having that initial conversation and also that conversation around imposter syndrome, specifically to do with kind of climate change, climate action and all, climate justice, all these sort of climate related words. I wonder if we could kind of maybe start a conversation about how we all feel about this particular part of climate work and where kind of both the Nature Library and the Glasgow Women's Library kind of fit into these conversations. I don't know if either of you had any kind of starting thoughts.
Well, when I was thinking about that, I thought that's how the Nature Library started, really, because it was when I started reading about climate issues from a different perspective, and particularly from a woman's perspective, that things started to click into place. Like, I knew the issues, I knew the problems, and I cared about them, but I don't know, something just felt a bit more, I don't want to say more real, but yeah, it just started to make a lot more sense. And there's something just about like the questions they were asking were the ones I was asking, or the things that I didn't realize I was asking, and they articulated it in a way that I connected with. So that's kind of, I thought, oh, well, this is suddenly working for me. I'll try to pull them all together and share them, and hopefully it connects with other people. Because it was something, I mean, I'm quite a, fairly privileged white woman. And so when it comes to representation, there's quite a lot of books that I have access to and I can read. So it just made me realize, God, actually just if it's that, reading from a woman's perspective, the difference that makes, it was huge.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, I think that's kind of same for us as well. I think Glasgow Women's Library, we we're a kind of library dedicated to women's lives and histories and achievements, and I think climate work really fits so well into that as well, because lots of work is around social justice, and climate justice one of the huge issues as well. Being in a library, and libraries being these kind of spaces of learning, and especially I feel in the Women's Library we're all just really open to learning and, you know, saying that we don't know everything, and it's a very kind of welcoming space for anyone to come in and learn about these issues, which just is a start to everything.
Absolutely, yeah, 100%. Kirsten, I wonder what your perspective is about that, because we've hosted events, kind of inspiration feminism for library events about imposter syndrome, but I wonder what your kind of take on imposter syndrome when it comes to climate change and climate action is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's something that's so present in all the conversations now. We're a profession that's about 75% women, and I think climate activism, everybody from Greta onwards, women's voices and young women's voices have been integral. And I'm struck actually, even listening to the fantastic conversation so far, of not just the challenges that this historically presents, but also the opportunities. You know, if I think of the Women's Library, the Green Creative Cluster, I get the impression, Annika, that that's all hands on deck. It's everybody from co-directors to volunteers and everyone in between. So there's a beautiful horizontality to this work. There's a levelling, there's an equal, perhaps it's actually the way that we inhabit the world. And of course, that makes it a perfect fit for libraries, because that's what we're all about: equality of opportunity, quality of learning, access for all. So I think that it's an intriguing triangulation between libraries, between sustainability, and between women's lives and women's stories. But I know that we're very excited at Phillips to play a little part in that, and you can see from the organisations that we're bringing together today, just how powerful that can be in Scotland and around the world.
Absolutely. So I think on the back of that, if we start to think about the library as a physical building, and I think, Annika, you already kind of touched on this, I think that Glasgow Women's Library is a really great example of an institution which is looking to make a difference to the home of information, not just the content within it. We might think of Glasgow Women's Library as a bit of a greenhouse. Its transparent and open values symbolised by the glass and the culture of warmth, openness and ideas which are inspired and supported to grow within. We were very excited to share the work of the Net Zero Handbook from Glasgow Women's Library, which is a practical plan setting out the changes the organisation will make to the building to reach, quote, operational net zero by 2030. So Annika, I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about this work.
Yeah, absolutely. I love the kind of idea of the Women's Library as a glass house. The building itself is actually made of sandstone, of course, but we're located in Carnegie Library that is now over 120 years old, which comes with lots of challenges. During lockdown, the Green Cluster commissioned a net zero handbook from a local architect firm called Dress for the Weather. They basically came up with this really comprehensive, very practical 3-stage plan for us to reach operational net zero by 2030. And since then, we've been fundraising so that we can start these building works. So the first phase is insulating the building. So we've taken this kind of fabric first approach, wanting to make the fabric the kind of envelope of the building as kind of weather tight as possible, before then moving on to improving the services, such as upgrading the ventilation and the archive cooling system, and then eventually at the third phase, installing renewables such as and air source heat pump and solar panels and a battery storage. So we're now at the first stage, hoping to start the installation works later this year, potentially. And it's been a really interesting learning journey for me as well. I've been the project coordinator for the Net Zero project, and we've been working with Dress for the Weather, which has been really great. Also need to kind of maybe explain what operational net zero means and what net zero is, but because it is kind of one of these almost like buzzwords that gets thrown around a lot, and it doesn't, in most cases it won't mean that your emissions are actually zero. In our case, it means that we're aiming for the target that's been set by the kind of Royal Incorporated Architects, the RIBA, for existing buildings of less than 55 kilowatt hours per metre square per year. So we're aiming a lot lower than that. So we're aiming to around 32 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. And so we're aiming to get to that before 2030, which is before kind of the target that Scotland has set. But we just wanted to kind of almost lead on this way and just set this quite an ambition but a realistic target for ourselves, and not just kind of aim for the general target, but hoping to get there by 2030.
I think that's a really interesting point though about, you know, not just going for the target set by other people, but also going, what can we realistically achieve, and could it be lower than that? That's really inspiring to hear that that's what the Glasgow Women's Library are doing. They've actually, you've taken the time to really figure out what can we do and what sort of things are achievable for us. Yeah,
obviously this is the kind of bigger project that all these capital works that require a lot of money, a lot of funding, but alongside of that we're also doing kind of smaller things that we can do ourselves or with kind of less funding. For example, a couple of years ago we got secondary glazing installed in all our windows, which has made a huge difference, make it more airtight, and it has definitely made an impact on how much we have to use the heating and use energy in the building, and things like switching into LED lights, just always working to improve our kind of waste and recycling management and things like that.
It's amazing. And I know that the handbook, it's available online, isn't it? We've got a beautiful copy with us in the podcast studio today, yes. And there are a few print copies at the library, but all the library professionals who are listening along, they can find that link, can't they, and delve in, because it's such a beautiful mix of aspiration and tangible steps to actually achieve that aspiration. And I feel that as well as so much of this work, it blends the personal and professional in really interesting ways. And Glasgow Women's Library was my grandma's childhood library back in Bridgeton when she was a wee girl, and we've been back since and had a great look. But when you mentioned this gorgeous Carnegie building and the brightness and the shadow side of that in terms of energy efficiency as well as its history, and it's just incredible to think and inspirational to think that the greenest building can be the one that you're already in, the one that you're already inhabiting, that communities use and love with these adjustments as you're kind of pioneering and leading the way with.
I feel like there's something there about like the reusing and the recycling, almost like, rather than, as you said, building something new and be like, oh, this is kind of falling apart, so let's, start something new. It's like, no, actually we can just like tweak this and we can work on it and we can make this better, rather than always thinking it needs to be a new thing. It's like, worked with what we've got.
Yeah, absolutely. Just tweaks. I mean, many people I think will relate to that, especially me living in the East End of Glasgow. My flat is currently not watertight, but I think there's, even just that kind of concept of people going, how can I fix this, or what are the little tweaks and adjustments that I make? I think it's such an important message, not only to take and to spread within the library sector, but also just kind of out with that. And I hope that people kind of take that and run with it. What has the reception from the community been like for the Net Zero Handbook and for some of the changes that you've made and are going to be making?
It's been good. We had a launch event for the handbook last summer. And there's been a lot of interest from kind of industry professionals to other organisations, just to learn about kind of different practical ways and options for retrofitting existing buildings, especially listed buildings. And I would definitely encourage people to have a look at it. And it has been written in a very accessible way for someone who might not have read much about these building improvements before. And I think just what I think is really important is sharing knowledge about these projects, helping other organisations to kind of do this kind of knowledge exchange, because it can be quite daunting and there's a lot of big words and technical terms, and it's just very important to just make it more accessible.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important message as well about the accessibility of it, so that people, when they're listening to the episode, can actually fully understand the language and the phrasing that they're engaging with, because I think that's the only way that we're going to ever make a kind of practical difference. So yeah, I think kind of thinking about the concept of a library and the innards of it, if there's any place to feel comfortable not knowing something, I think it's the library, because you're surrounded by an infrastructure of support and knowledge which is sure to start you on whatever journey it is that you're trying to achieve. So the Nature Library is such a gorgeous and welcoming environment, Christina, I wonder if you could share a little bit about being the person to found the library space, and especially one which is so explicitly shaped by content about the natural environment.
Thank you. I hope it is like that when you come visit. It was kind of, that's just what I was reading, you know. I was reading nature writing. It kind of started off with maybe older texts that were just all about the beauty of the natural world, and it was the more kind of man goes out into nature and has a nice time, which was great. And it made me like really fall in love with the places that I had never been before. And then I started, you know, reading more writing by women, and it was just kind of changing how I felt. So in terms of shaping it around texts about the natural environment, that was just the books there was no other books I would have put in a library. And in terms of how it became a library, that was just the logical form for it, because I had books to share, and that's how you share them. But I feel like the more, I mean, ever since it started, and the more I've been like speaking to librarians and learning more about librarianship and just what these, like, whether it's the building or the librarians or just the effect they have on a community, it was like, oh, this is actually the most incredible form this could have taken. Like, of course it should be a library. And there are so many other ways to share this information, you know, but the library just made a lot of sense. In terms of finding, like, being the person to found a library space, when I was thinking about that, I don't know if this is imposter syndrome again. Like, I don't feel like I have that connection of like, oh, I made a library. It feels like the library kind of already, like, the books already existed, the space existed, and it's just a case of, you know, putting them in one place. So yeah, I don't know. I still maybe just have that imposter syndrome if I don't feel like a proper librarian yet.
He's looking at me on her right because I'm ready to sound the imposter syndrome back.
I know.
So loud. My gosh, we're calling these Carnegie libraries over a century later, so that's definitely, it's the Christina Riley Library.
Yeah,
one
okay.
woman tour de force that has been across every corner of Scotland.
But the thing is, because especially when it comes to the travelling library, it has had a lot of help with it, because it goes to amazing spaces. And they've been, helping me with, you know, like, oh, like, we have this space and you can put the library there. So I think that's why I'm just like, I have the books or they have the space. And it's, I suppose, it's a collaborative effort. And I'm just the one who just really wants to share the books. So I've been enjoying doing that.
Okay, I'll allow it later.
Okay.
And I suppose off the back of that, the Nature Library, as you have just mentioned, used to be a travelling collection. And I kind of wonder how this collection has evolved and what community engagement you received when you were touring your collections. How has the Nature Library having a permanent home changed your perspective on your work or your collections, if at all? And are your environmental considerations different now?
I think for environmental considerations, I'm quite fortunate in that the Nature Library has a very small carbon footprint, essentially. I don't drive, so it's usually, often I'll take a small amount of books on a train, that kind of thing. And now that I'm in a permanent space, it is an old flat, but it's very small. It doesn't really have the kind of considerations that I know buildings like the Glasgow Women's Library will have, and whether that's with heating or lights being on all the time, like, I don't really have that consideration. So for that, it's been fairly simple, but I've definitely changed with how I kind of decide what's in the library, I think. And the more that I meet different people come into the library, that's definitely helping to shape it, because while it was traveling, or when it does travel, sometimes I can be there the whole time. There's been like weekend pop-ups where I can be there the 2 full days and I get to actually speak to people, and the difference that makes is like astonishing. I feel like I'm always it sounds like I'm over exaggerating, but it is like life-changing when you just talk. I think like librarians understand that.
Absolutely.
Like, like it can just like send you off on all these different routes. So I thought, God, if even 2 days of that can have that effect, then I feel like I'm getting to experience that now with the library being open all the time, and just hearing different people's, like, what they're looking for, like hearing what people are interested in, what they want to see on the shelves, and trying to kind of, I don't know, just kind of think about what people want to read, or I don't want to say what people should read, but, you know, just having that conversation and helping them, or like, they help shape the library itself.
Absolutely. I think that was it was a lovely experience when we brought SILITS members to come and visit the library, and there was one particular member who was just so enthused. She absolutely loved it, and she was like, oh my god, I can't believe you have these books on these really specific things, like I study this and this will be a great resource. And is that what you're talking about, that sort of reception?
I know that you're talking about, and that to me, when I saw that, or when we were speaking, I was like, this is exactly what you're looking for as a librarian. It's like, you've put them on the shelves, you found something that is new to you and is interesting, and it's led you somewhere new. Like, that's tick, tick, tick. That's what you want.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I feel like that's all you can really hope for, and yeah, that's hopefully more of that.
Yeah, yes, more of that. More libraries and more of that.
I remember that visit, and it was honestly, it's such a, again, going back to that word organic, it was a library just embodied in the conversations and the knowledge exchange. It was not contained to the shelves. It wasn't just that we were all privately picking our favourite book and reading quietly. We were learning from one another in dialogue. And my last visit to the library this weekend, it was exactly the same. A gentleman had donated a nest collection, which was just astonishing. So we had a local ornithology expert, we had a lady who was repairing the sewing machine, just learning from one another every time people interact in this space. It's dazzling. That has been I mean, I feel like every time I talk to friends about like, oh, this is like, so who, like, this is who came to the library this weekend and this is what happened, I feel like I'm like making it up or something, or I'm like, am I like in a like comedy show, or like just it's just all these like amazing, really unique experiences. Like the bird's nest coming in, I just thought, okay, of course you've got nests you want to donate, and then someone being in and being able to kind of help identify, or even if, again, like not knowing what they are, but just having that conversation and trying to figure it out is amazing. It sounds so simple, but I feel like what this is making me realize is just how important that those kind of human interactions are. And not to sound like, I don't think I'm a technophobe, I mean, we're able to do this like podcasting, I'm on Instagram as much as the next person, but there's something about like that just human interaction that is definitely being lost in a lot of areas of our lives, and libraries are one of those places, one of the very few kind of common spaces that we can experience that. And just things like that, I mean, it's not always as, you know, unusual as like bird's nest coming in, like it can just be like the smallest thing, but it just has such an effect. The microcosmic to the macrocosmic, and there's such a valuable advocacy piece in that as well. In these conversations, you never know quite whose ear you have and the difference that they could make. And I was thinking, Annika, when you're sharing about the Net Zero Handbook launch, it's such a terrific event. I think we have some photographs of it, and when I remember back to last summer, one of the striking things was how many decision makers came along, how many local politicians, and of course that is something that we're fighting for all the time in libraries, as Leah knows, especially in our community libraries, to just make sure that decision makers understand the depth and breadth of what we're doing. And it seemed like on that occasion the Net Zero Handbook was the way into that for them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about kind of engaging more people in these conversations, and yeah, it was great to have kind of local decision makers and politicians there as well.
You've had some visitors to the Nature Library as well, haven't you?
Yeah, I've had a few politicians come in to visit and spend the time talking, and I think that's really important for them to see as well, that we are, you know, learning about these issues, and we're being able to have conversations about them and ask them questions, and, you know, basically just be able to say, are you doing what you're supposed to be doing? And like, you know, because the more knowledge that you have, I mean, it's such a cliche, like knowledge is power, but I feel like that's what the Nature Library like has been, or reading about climate issues has been doing for me, and for I know other people, being able to know more makes you feel more hopeful. Even if you're reading about things that make you worried or scared about the future, like it's actually the opposite. It makes me hopeful for the future, because I think, oh, okay, now I understand a bit more about what's going on and what they need to do. So that makes me feel a bit like, okay, I can see the route.
I think that's such an interesting point about, you know, the preservation of these spaces, like you were talking about, Annika, with like the actual preservation of the building as a space, but also the preservation of these spaces as spaces to come together. But also, you know, the fact that politicians and decision makers and people with influence won't really fully understand the value and the difference that these places and spaces make until they're physically in these spaces. I think it's just as much about sustainability as it is about, you know, being politically active, and a kind of that idea, as you say, Kirsten, of advocacy, and actually preserving these spaces for future generations, but also preserving the spaces so that decision makers can come and visit and understand the value that they give to patrons.
I always come back to that idea of, I mean, you've said it before, like libraries are sustainable by nature. Exactly. And So if you're wanting to have a conversation about climate issues, then what better place to have them than in a library, and what better place to kind of be able to gather everyone, because libraries are accessible to, you know, you'd hope like everyone from all ages, and the climate issues affect everyone as well. So it just makes, I suppose, like I said earlier, it just makes so much sense for these two things to be together.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think for like libraries are kind of such an important space for that as well, in kind of acknowledging that it's, at least we kind of want to put out that it's, the learning itself isn't a one-way street. We're not just, you know, somewhere for people to come and learn about, you know, climate activism. We really want to learn from the people who come into the library as well. And we often have kind of volunteers coming in, or learners, or just visitors. We want to engage in these conversations, and just learning from them and their ideas is just really valuable for us as well.
Absolutely. I think, Annika, in our initial conversation, and I think this chimes quite well with that we spoke about the library garden and your experience having volunteers and staff come and contribute, which created a kind of parity of experience for everyone, whether you had a green thumb or not, and whether you were the director or a volunteer. And I think this is a really lovely visual for our listeners. So could you maybe say a wee bit more about the kind of creation of the library garden?
Yeah, of course. I love talking about the garden. We basically just across from our building, there's this empty lot that's just been empty for years, just sometimes used as a car park, but most often just kind of locked away, not used at all. And for the Glasgow International Festival this summer, we worked with a Glasgow-based artist called Reiko Gota-Collins, who does really incredible work around kind of especially trees and interspecies empathy. And we worked with her to develop the space into a garden, the Glasgow Women's Library Garden. And basically the garden was a part of the exhibition called Peace Arbour for the GI Festival, where we also had work from Yoko Ono studio. Basically it was kind of all hands on deck, shoveling soil into raised beds that were also made from recycled materials by Reiko and her partner.
Brilliant.
Which was great. Or planting fruit trees, or building. We had a great volunteer who built a beautiful table for the garden, or putting up a gazebo, which was more than challenging. For sure. And it's just been such a special place, just having that this summer, and hopefully kind of longer into the future as well. And I think it really has shown what you were talking about, Christina, about the human interactions, and how the garden has really opened up the space for the library, and just how we're kind of catching a lot more people, lots of just people from the local area, some of our neighbours who might not have been to the library otherwise. But basically the garden kind of has acted as almost a gateway to the library, because it's there, it's visible, people are interested, you can just wander in, anyone's welcome, you can come and have your lunch, or just have a seat and enjoy the sun when the sun's out.
Yes.
We've had so many kind of really special interactions with our neighbours that I don't think would have happened without the garden. So it has kind of really been so beneficial on lots of levels for the library as well.
Yeah.
I was thinking that it's totally about that. I mean, just you saying the word neighbours, and having the Nature Library in a space now, and getting to meet people on there, and again, just having a place that gives people the option to or the opportunity to go in and meet other people and introduce themselves. But it's weird that whenever I think about it, I think how it's strange, because reading is such an individual act, and it's very private, and it's quiet, and all these things that we need and love. But it also, I suppose, like, having the library space is what gives us that community interaction. Like, I love the garden. That would be, obviously a dream of the Nature Library one day. There's a shared garden out back, and one of my neighbours has come in and she like showed me all the gardening, like sunflowers that they've grown and stuff. So then you think, well, could you come in and like teach other people, or like talk to people about gardening? And that, just like this, it's all these things that we don't really always know, and you don't know who to ask or how to get started. And then having the garden there so people have that opportunity to start. And
you're really in a place to be able to facilitate these connections, aren't you? From the people that wander in, then going, how can we use you? And people are always willing to share, because I think the kind of general consensus is always that people love libraries, and they're so willing to, and sometimes they don't necessarily have a platform to share the knowledge that they have. And I think that's really important, that you can turn up at a library and go, can I throw a free event here? And 9 times out of 10 they'll say yes. And I think that's a really important part to kind of facilitating this, and these kind of gaps that exist where they might not be able to facilitate them in a different space, they're able to do it in a library. So
there's something beautifully connective coming out, and it takes me back to our initial conversation, because I know we talked about, actually, although some people would identify as climate activists and many others wouldn't, none of us really have the choice of whether we inhabit this world or not. We are part of this crisis, and therefore we're all part of the solution. And actually, it was so eloquent the way you put that, Christina, with the relationship between a reader and a text. And then with my author hat on, I think they're not totally alone. Whoever is reading a book, in fact, they're having a conversation with somebody, even if it's, as is the case with much of the Nature Library and the Women's Library collection, it's authors from decades, if not centuries earlier. There's a dialogue there. There's both parts of the equation are relevant, have to matter and do matter, and that's almost a beautiful parallel with the relationship that we have to the natural world, kind of going back to the rights and responsibilities, and just that we are in dialogue, we are in collaboration, to go back to the earlier theme.
That's how it makes me think about climate, when I say it all clicked into place, that's totally how it feels. It's like you're opening that dialogue, and you're starting to see where things fit in amongst each other. Whenever I think, I know we've had this conversation before, and whenever I think about these things, I imagine a big painting, and if you're looking at the painting really, really close at the human in the painting, and then when you're reading, you're like, oh, there's something over there, and it just, everything kind of pulls into focus, because that seems too close. It's it gets bigger, but you see the whole picture all of a sudden. Totally. And I think especially, I suppose, over lockdown, and when we were reading a lot, it actually opens worlds for us, and it gets us to meet people that we would otherwise never get to meet. So it's just great.
Hello, post-production Leah here. I've come to cut this conversation slightly short for the time being, but not to worry. In the last part of this segment, we touch on the future of green libraries and what effective support and investment could and should look like to support this programme of green libraries. Plus, we share some eco-feminism book recommendations, which you can go and collect from Glasgow Women's Library or the Nature Library the next time you're visiting. This final part of the segment will be at the end of part 2 of Taking Root, so be sure to tune in and listen to both episodes.
With so much to say on this topic, this podcast episode is already bursting at the seams with innovation, community, library voices, and much more. This is why we've made the decision to split this podcast into different episodes. Hopefully they will exist as resources you'll share and come back to, and in a sense you might reuse and recycle the content in its own way.
Please don't forget to check out the rest of the Green Library story, where we'll share what we've done to support our members to enact change in their library services and beyond, including hearing all about this year's Green Library Scotland Grant Fund recipients from all across the nation.